Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so please like the video and subscribe to the channel before that. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I'll never should have walked that path along the Seine after midnight. There are places in this world that shift in the dark, where time softens and something ancient begins to stir. I came to Paris to bury my granddaddy, a man I hardly knew, a librarian by trade, reclusive and sharp-witted, according to them that spoke of him at the funeral. He'd lived his final years stuck away in a crumbling apartment on the Rue des Petits Champs, hiding behind heavy curtains and walls lined with books older than dirt. I inherited it all: apartment, journals, debt. What I didn't inherit was any understanding of the man, and that's where the trouble started. The apartment reeked of old ink and rotten leather. Dust hung thick in the air like a fog. Everything felt muted, drained of color, as though reality itself had faded from this space before he passed. His journals were crazy. The first night, jet-lagged and restless, I flipped through one of the older volumes and found drawings of clocks. Dozens of them, each sketched with unnatural precision, but none of them showed the same time. Underneath every image in his cramped hand, the dark hour does not obey. I didn't know what it meant. I figured he was plumb crazy. But on my fourth night, something strange started happening. I woke up to a pressure, a subtle curling into it. Sense of displacement, like my limbs were slightly out of whack with reality. The light from the street lamp outside had gotten dimmer. Its glow turned a sickly blue that filtered through the curtains like light under deep water. I checked the time. 1:13 a.m. My watch hands twitched backward. 1:12. Then forward again. 1:14. The motion was smooth, but not natural. I held my breath and watched the minute hand slide, stall, then shudder back. The air was so still it hurt my ears. Outside, that cobblestone street was dead silent. Not empty, silent. No wind, no echo, no distant engines, no chirping brakes. Just a complete deadening of sound, like I'd been buried alive in the world's biggest mausoleum. I felt it first in my chest, that ancient instinct that something else was present. Not in the room, but somewhere just beyond the veil of reason. Something vast and half-formed pressing against the seams of perception. Then a faint tick, tick, tick. I thought it was the wall clock, but it was slower, deliberate. It wasn't a clock. It was a heartbeat. The days went on like normal, almost stubbornly so. The cafes bustled, the light turned golden each afternoon, and tourists cluttered the streets like nothing unusual had ever happened in this city. I told myself I'd been dreaming. Jet lag, wine, and grief. All very explainable. But at night, it came back. Every night, 1:13 a.m., the silence, the heartbeat, and the smell. It emerged gradual, like the scent of wet stone and burnt wax. It reminded me of catacombs, of tombs, of history too old to be written down. Soon, I stopped sleeping. Instead, I walked through alleyways and courtyards that had no names, down winding routes the locals avoided. Paris is old, older than most folks understand. Some parts were not built, they were revealed. I started to notice something about the city's architecture. Doorways lower than they should be, windows sealed with blackened iron, entire streets that vanished from my maps. One night I passed a church I'd never seen before, its bell tower listed to one side, its stained glass dark with soot. It was 1:13 a.m., and the sky had turned velvet black, moonless, starless. A man stood by the entrance, pale, in shadow, unmoving. I blinked, and he was gone. It was on the sixth night that the boundaries truly started to erode. I stood before the Seine, watching the water flow backward. It wasn't a trick of light. The ripples moved upstream, slow and thick like blood. The riverbanks warped, lengthened. Trees leaned inward. The Eiffel Tower in the distance seemed farther away than it had ever been, its top shrouded in a darkness that pulsed like breath. My watch read 1:13. I couldn't tell how long these moments lasted. Hours would vanish. I'd return to my granddaddy's apartment and find that the clocks had melted, literally warped like softened wax. Pages in his journals had been torn out and replaced with diagrams I had not drawn. At some point, I stopped recognizing my reflection. Not that it changed, but I changed. My thoughts slowed during the day. Food lost its taste. Sounds felt too sharp, like everything existed 2 frequencies too high. People on the street no longer looked me in the eye. Some crossed themselves as I passed. Others smiled too long. I remember one woman, eyes wide with something like recognition or fear, as she whispered, "Il est dans l'heure." He's in the hour. I found a key, inside a hidden drawer in my granddaddy's desk, behind a false panel. The brass was cold despite the summer heat. Attached to it, a torn scrap of paper in his slanted script. Saint Etienne, the bell that should never ring. Saint Etienne wasn't listed on any map, but in the dark hour, places appear that should not be. I waited. 1:13 a.m. The silence fell like a curtain. I stepped into the street, walked without thinking, and there it was. The same church, crooked, skeletal, pulsing with a dim interior light, like a lantern behind diseased skin. The door opened for me. Inside, the scent was unbearable. Old tallow, mold, something burnt and sweet. Candles floated in the air, unsuspended by holders, flickering without wind. The nave was narrow, stretched impossibly long, with pews facing backward toward the entrance instead of the altar. Their backs carved with symbols my mind refused to hold. And at the front, beneath the shattered rose window, stood a bell. Massive, hung from black beams that reached into shadow. It was not made of metal. Its surface shimmered like dried bone lacquered with oil, and it pulsed with a soundless rhythm, in sync with the heartbeat I'd heard in my room. My granddaddy had drawn this bell. In his journals, he called it L'heure creuse, the hollow hour, a time that's not time, a moment that leaks into hours from something older. That night, I touched the bell, and that was when everything fractured. I awoke on my apartment floor. My ears were bleeding. Outside, it was still dark. 1:13 a.m. But everything had changed. The air was heavier now. Time did not flow but circled, looping endlessly like a song on a broken record. Shadows no longer stayed attached to objects. They moved. They watched. I started seeing others. Men and women in long coats, walking too slow, with faces blurred like old film reels. They drifted along the alleys, pausing only to stare at me with no eyes. I come to understand they were resonant, beings caught in the same fracture, victims of the hour. Some had been trapped for centuries. Some were not human at all. I tried to leave, booked flights, called cabs, but nothing left the city. At 1:13 a.m., all exits closed. I rode the metro in endless loops. Each station decayed further than the last. By the 7th station, the train was empty, and the walls outside the windows were alive, moving with patterns like breathing stone. I found my granddaddy's final journal wedged between floorboards I'd never noticed. Its pages were brittle, each marked with timestamps. 1:13 a.m. Again and again. He'd mapped the movements of the city during the hour. It changed nightly, like a labyrinth that shifted to trap whatever still remembered escape. On the last page, his writing turned erratic. The bell is not a sound. It is a summon. It calls what sleeps beneath the city. The dark hour's a door. I opened it. Now I cannot close it. I started dreaming of rooms with no doors, staircases that looped, of chanting in dead languages echoing through the metro tunnels. Always the bell, always the pulse. It was in my teeth, my spine, my mind. Paris ceased to resemble itself. Buildings leaned wrong. Windows blinked. Graffiti rearranged into rooms when I wasn't looking. And that smell, like burning time, followed me. One night, I wandered into the Louvre after hours. No alarms, no guards. Their eyes followed not with paint, but with presence. The Mona Lisa wept dark tears. A statue near the Egyptian wing cracked open at the chest, revealing a hollow, beating mass inside. In the sculpture garden, beneath a ceiling of shifting sky, I saw my granddaddy, naked, mouth open in silent scream, skin stretched too thin across his bones, fingers fused into something like hooves. He held a clock in his chest cavity, its hands spinning violently, melting, reforming. He reached toward me, and time shattered. I no longer know how many nights I've been here. Sometimes I believe I'm still in that moment, still touching the bell, that none of this is real, or all of it is too real for my mind to comprehend. I am not alone. There are others, walking in circles, whispering in tongues their ancestors forgot. They gather at 1:13 a.m., on rooftops, in the catacombs, in reflections. Last night, I saw myself walking in the opposite direction. He looked well rested. He smiled. I think he's trying to replace me. I've locked every clock away, blacked out every window. I no longer sleep. I no longer eat. I simply wait. Because once the hour begins, it never truly ends. The rest of the day is merely its reflection, twisted into something livable. Tonight, I'll return to the church. I must. The bell is calling again. The heart of Paris beats not with life, but with memory, and I have become its keeper. If you're reading this, leave Paris before the dark hour finds you, because once it does, it never lets go. The rain hadn't stopped for hours, and it wasn't the thunder that stayed awake with me. It was the scratching in the walls. Not rats, not plumbing, something intentional, measured, and wrong. I pulled up to the house on Hollow Ridge Lane as twilight was descending, windshield wipers thwacking back and forth across glass streaked with oily film and rain that had fallen unrelenting since morning. Outside, the world was blurring into a watercolor of rapidly deepening gray, fields bluish tinting, rolling by for miles, and stately trees shivering beneath the lash of the wind. The 2 nights in my late grandfather's mansion to finalize some final papers and recover what was left of his own possessions. The lawyer had said it was straightforward, a footnote, but the estate otherwise. The house itself was 3 stories, black slate and ivy-covered brick, brooding away on the valley side like a relic. It looked older than the hills themselves, windows heavy-lidded and dark. Climbing out of the car, the cold wrapped round me like the breath of a crypt, metallic, wet, old. The air smelled of moss and iron. In the distance, I positively heard the faint bleating of sheep, but even this was quickly overwhelmed by the steady hiss of rain. The front door creaked open with a protesting squeak, and inside the house no fresher odor, one of moist wood, mothballs, and a faintly sulfur smell, the bitter sting of smoke matches that never found their end. I spilled my bag on the hallway, water flowing behind me along buckled floorboards. Every creak somehow became accusatory. Electricity was operating, just. Lamps would flicker when turned on. Halos anemic and jaundiced, and central heating had not functioned for decades. There were no mirrors in the house. I noticed that peculiar lack in a moment, but I might never have known to put my finger on why it was important. All of the reflective surfaces were taken down or covered over, as if the walls themselves shuddered with reflection. The sole exception was a dirty hand mirror hidden under an attic bedsheet, one I would not come to know until too late to ignore what it revealed. I walked the first hour of each room, sensing their emptiness, their tender rot. Wallpaper curled up in spiral clots like infected tissue. Family portraits smiled at me with eyes too realistic, as though they'd been painted in with some sympathetic sap, something that pulsed under moonlight. My grandfather's office stayed exactly as he'd left it, I supposed. Paper covering the floor like fallen leaves, a cracked sphere on the equator, a decanter of black, dark liquid untouched on the desk. I could not recall much about him. He died when I was a child, and even then, I had hardly ever laid eyes on him, once or twice. A tall, rugged man, with a screeching voice like stones on marble floors. My mother never spoke of him often. I'd thought he was merely another victim of family schisms, not some dreadful figure she ran from. But her silence may be warning me now. At night, the storm became more intense. Rain pounded against the panes in fingernail on a fingerboard. Wind screamed through the house's bones, and in the pipes, something growled in wet, slow rhythms, like the thud of a restless animal pacing in the pipes. I made a fire in the hearth, but the fire did not warm. Shadows twisted oddly in the jig of the fire, clumping in places where they shouldn't have been. And at midnight, I heard it for the first time. A scratch, low and deliberate. Not the wild skitter of mice, but deliberate, like nails over stone, stopping, resuming. I climbed the stairs, hearing the sound, its pitch rising as I ascended. The banister cold and sticky under my fingers. My own steps echoed hollowly, as if the house had become deep, hollowed. The noise swept me to the third floor, to a door that had been resistant when I'd tried turning the handle. It now creaked open with ease, and no more effort than that. As if blown aside, a tiny nursery lay beyond, years unbleached, furniture shrouded in white sheets, yellowed to age. A tin moon mobile lay motionless above a crib. Scratching stopped at my arrival, and the air chilled, thickened, purified. I spun round gradually, and there, just behind the curtain, I saw the shape of a hand, pushing out from the other side of the material. But when I pushed back the curtain, nothing. Steamed window pane and rain pummeling outside. And then there were the dreams. ... I hadn't remembered sleeping that night. I recall lying awake, staring up at the ceiling, listening for rustling leaves, or voices outside the window. But somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, somehow, I collapsed in, and the nightmares folded around me. In them, I wandered through the house once more, but it was altered as it was. The walls flowed smoothly, the paintings wept, the fireplace billowed black smoke. My grandfather was seated in the study, his eyes hollow, his fingers smeared with ink, tracing symbols that changed when I looked too long. And in the depths of the floorboards, something stirred. The next day, the air was thick, not figuratively, literally. It was like treading water to navigate through the house, as if gravity was more viscous. My body hurt. My breathing was shallow. Outside, the rain had intensified, collecting in black water that reflected the house not as it stood, but older, more decayed, wrong. Scratching had resumed by noon. It was this hour at the base of the stairs. Unrolling the carpet, I found a small hatch, a one I didn't even know existed, etched with crude symbols the same as the ones in my dream. I dumbly opened it, and I could see a ladder leading down into blackness. I swore I wouldn't go down, that I would shut it off and call somebody, anybody. But that evening I went down. I lied to myself and said it was curiosity, sense, the necessity of casting out unreasonable fear. But I now realize otherwise, that it was something else, something that had to do with the very essence of the house, pulling me down like a marionette on strings. The air chilled with every step up the ladder rungs. My phone's light insufficiently lit the darkness. The passage walls were slimy, throbbing roots covering it, as though the earth was alive and rotting the house that rested upon it. A room at the ground level, round, carved out of stone. In the center had been an altar, an ancient one, slick with what I hoped was water. The walls bore glyphs, not cut but seared into the rock. And on the other wall, on the far side of the room, a mirror, the attic hand mirror, its silver tarnished, the surface rippling like agitated oil. I walked up to it, although I do not recall walking. My hand rose up on its own. I looked into it and saw nothing of me, only the house. From above, as if the house was where the earth became one with the ground, its roots going deep into the ground, its shadow lying across the valley in entire. And then they stood there, water-soaked bodies standing in fields beyond the house. Dozens, faceless, wet, still, watching. I awoke in the corridor, no memory of ascending. Soaking wet clothes, mirror adhered to my chest. That night, the whispering started. It was from within the walls, beneath the bed, behind the door. Whispers, not words but intent, a tongue prior to words, heard not for sound, but fear. The whispers spoke of an ancient bargain, centuries old, of sacrifice and blood, of a debt paid years and years before, unpaid. And I remembered my grandfather's funeral, how no one had ever seen the body, how the coffin was shut up, how my mother would not leave. And I knew I was not the heir, I was the offering. I attempted to flee last night. I packed my bag, made a run for the door, but beyond lay a different world. The trees had shifted, the road was gone. There remained only marsh and mud and constant rain behind. The house had faced away from the clock. It no longer operated on day and night. It breathed, pulsed, waited. I barricaded myself in a study, the buzzing desk mirror, the walls whispering, growing louder, closer. The faces on the walls shifting, each face mine, streaming, blending, transmuting. I am here, sitting writing this. Fingers on the keys, and I don't even know if they are mine. Scratching again, closer. Under the surface, perhaps. The rain thumps the panes, and in its beat I hear words, a chant, an invitation. I don't know if you will ever find this. I don't know if anyone else left the world after we did. But if you do, if you are reading this note hidden under the floorboards, or stored behind the ruined panel in the study, don't look in the mirror. Don't chase the sound. Get out of the house. Set it on fire if you can. For I have looked into the future, in that which is dark and through which light is unable to penetrate, in that emptiness between the circle of the clock, when rain is interpreted into voice and the past comes to lay its claim. I saw it, and now it sees me. Even today, I can sense the cold of the water on my ankles, a ghostly feeling that stays with me many years after I ran from the village. It was not simply that it was cold, it was how the water seemed to tug at me, not as if from a current, but as if memory taking shape. as if it recalled me even before I was born. I hadn't intended to stay. The village had only been a stop, a forgotten notation on my grandfather's map that I discovered buried in the attic when he died. The ink was faded and the paper was yellowed with age, but there it was, a small circle traced around a name I never knew. Karshad. No roads went there now. No websites named it. As if it had been erased on purpose, with meticulous attention. But I went anyway. I said to myself it was curiosity, some romantic notion of tracing back family heritage. I said many things to myself before I got there. The truth only became apparent after I viewed the pond. That black, still emptiness at the center of the village, neither lovely nor disgusting, just there. As if it had existed forever, as if the village had encircled it like moss encircles a sore. The villagers were few and quiet, their eyes hollow, their footsteps cautious. I saw them only in glimpses. An old woman huddled behind a broken window, a boy observing me from under a warped porch. No one spoke, no one smiled, no one departed. The air was denser here, like sucking air through gauze that had been wet with old milk. I spent the night in the sole guest house, a low, wooden affair that creaked in the wind, but I never sensed any wind. The individual who handed me the key never once met my gaze. He just nodded at the room and walked back into the rear in silence. My nights became longer the instant I crossed over the village border. The sun took longer to come up, and sunset came too quickly, as if time itself grew thinner at the edges. And the dreams, they began straight away. In them, I stood on the pond's edge, observing ripples spread over the surface, though nothing had touched it. Something was happening beneath. Not a form, not even a presence. Just a sense of recognition, as if I was being remembered, not observed. I woke up covered in sweat, but cold. The sheets clung to me like seaweed. My limbs were reluctant to move, my tongue heavy in my mouth, as if I'd been in the water. Every day I said to myself that I would go, but every day something held me back, some cloud over my mind. I would roam instead, down cobbled, tangled lanes behind houses that leaned too much, their roofs hanging like the rids of spent animals. And always, necessarily, I would find myself at the pond. It wasn't big, 20 feet wide perhaps, but it contained no reflections. I could stare into it for hours and never catch a glimpse of myself. Birds wouldn't fly over it. Insects buzzed above the grass but never skittered across the water. I didn't see any fish, any frogs, not even algae. I did catch a glimpse of movement once. A ripple broke the surface while I stood staring. My chest tightened, and I leaned forward, expecting to see a bird or a leaf, but the water stilled again too quickly, too obediently. Like a held breath, released just as I noticed it. That night, the dream deepened. I was under the pond, but I didn't drown. There was no light, but I saw, not with eyes, but with memory. I saw something old, sleeping, something ancient and massive that I couldn't possibly understand, but only its feeling. Hunger bound in yearning. Something had been taken from it ages ago, something that carried my blood. I woke up to find dirt under my fingernails. My hands trembled for hours afterward. I washed them, rubbed until the skin burned red, but the odor remained. A damp, brackish decay that stuck like smoke in my clothing. I opened the window and vomited on the parched earth below. And then I heard it, a sucking sound, drawn slowly through rushes. It issued from the direction of the pond. I turned my head, but the sight was occluded by the slats in the shutters and the enmeshed limbs of trees I had not remembered seeing. I had not slept very long, but the country looked different, less village-like and more remembered village. Worn at the edges, fuzzy where it needed to be cleared. I made myself get out of the room. The guest house hall was darker than normal. The bulbs above cast flickering, weak, yellow light, buzzing like flies in a trap. There was no one behind the counter. I pushed through the front door and entered into silence. The air was wet, heavy. It clung to my skin like oil. Every step was a muffled one, as if I were walking in a dream. I didn't know why I was walking towards the pond, only that I needed to. When I reached the edge, the water looked deeper than before, endless. I bent down. My fingers hovered over the surface. The air above it was cold, unnaturally so, like winter trapped in the earth's breath. Then I noticed the markings. Carved on the stones along the edge of the pond's rim were distant etchings, symbols, not words, not letters, but something ancient. I ran one finger over a symbol. It was warm to my touch, although the stone was cold and dry. The breathing sound came back when I touched it, louder, nearer, not from the water, but beneath my feet. The earth pulsed with it. I lurched back harder, noticing the village for the first time. All the homes were dark. All the windows were watching. I spun to leave, to flee, to get away, but the ground behind me was different. Trees now leaned where grass used to stand. Roots writhed through the earth like veins, glowing with a faint pulse. I wasn't in the village anymore. I was underneath it. I walked for hours, or at least it seemed like hours. The sky overtopped grew dark, like bruises. My legs hurt. My mind became hazy. And then, as if called, the clearing reappeared, and I found myself again at the edge of the pond. But this time, it was filled with light. Not sunlight, not fire, something else. A beating greenish light that writhed in the water like a pulse. Forms swam within it, too elusive to be bodies, too distinct to be shadows. And I saw myself, not in reflection, but in replication. Drifting in the pond was my reflection. My face, white and still, eyes shut as if sleeping. I blinked. The man in the water didn't. I screamed, but the noise didn't travel. I took a step back. The ground gave way, and I plunged. But not into the pond. Into memory. Into their memory. I watched generations of villagers by the pond, beneath skies devoid of stars, whispering incantations in a language that twisted the air. I watched children submerged into the water, wide-eyed but not frightened. I watched them disappear, not drown, not flailing, just stop. I watched my grandfather, young, scared, cowering behind the trees, as a woman brought a small child to the water. The child was me. I woke up hours later on the ground of my room, freezing, drenched, mud under my nails and in my hair. My phone was dead. My watch stopped working. The window was ajar. The shutters were flapping on a wind I couldn't sense. That was the last night that I slept in the village. I ran before sunrise. The road curled around in strange directions, but I didn't halt. When I arrived in the nearest town, I attempted to speak of it, to tell someone what I had witnessed, but the word Karshad would not cross my lips, as though the recollection was slipping away even as I spoke it. Today, months hence, I can catch the scent of the pond on some evenings. I awaken gasping for air, lungs filled with chilly stillness. I discover water collecting under my bed, yet no pipe leaks. I notice shadows in mirrors that disappear when I shift, and in each puddle, each reflection, each silent moment, I catch that image of me, the one that drifted upon the pond, unblinking, waiting, and occasionally I find myself wondering, did I ever actually leave? Or did something leave instead of me? The village no longer exists on any map. My grandfather's journal is lost. Even the attic is bare now, as if none of it were, but the water lingers, and it remembers. It always remembers. I'd always thought silence a luxury, until I heard it breathe. Not the creaking of the house, not the crackle of trees or the wailing shriek of ancient plumbing, but the silence itself breathing, stilted and slow, like something hanging in the black above me. It started on a Thursday, the kind of day that thrums with the numbing heft of nothing special. My parents had gone early on a week's visit to visit relatives in Maine. I hadn't felt like going with them, not due to any teenage sulking, but merely because I liked being alone. There is a sort of luxury in having the whole house to oneself. No footsteps down the hallway, no grumbling of TV in another room, no scraping of knives and forks or slamming of drawers. Just quiet. That morning, I moved stealthy, barefoot through the empty house, floorboards cold and smooth under my feet. There was the hint of lemon oil from the wood polish my mother had applied with fervor. There was sunlight filtering through about the pulled curtains in shards, casting soft, quivering shadows on the walls. The wind stirred the trees outside, slowly and deliberately. Time grew and warped. The sort of day that causes the world to resemble an old painting, bent, distant from the real thing. I spent the better part of the afternoon reading, listening to rain pound against the windows. It had started softly, fingers drumming against glass, and intensified into thick rain that hid the world outside in moving watercolors. It was quiet. I did not have anything to fear, no rational reason for the creeping sensation of being watched. But it was there like humidity in the air, heavy and unseen. By evening time, the hallway lights started to dim. I blamed it on a power surge. Storms tended to wreck the wiring in our old house. The 1902 house had been renovated many times, but in spite of all the facelifts, the heart of it, oak beams, slate roof, labyrinthine basement, remained intact. My father once discovered an ancient newspaper secreted between the walls when he remodeled the attic, yellow and brittle, with ink that had long since dissolved into nothing years ago. The house, in its quiet manner, recalled. I turned on the hall light as I went to bed that evening. Not for fear, but a kind of instinct, a human response to something that was rapidly growing more and more unhuman. The wind was howling outside like some faraway beast. I stayed paralyzed, hearing it howl against the sides of the house, and I noticed this oddity. The wind didn't blow steadily. It grew and waited, as if it were answering something otherworldly, as breathing. 2:33 a.m. I awoke to quiet, utter, complete. The kind of silence that fills the room, that engulfs it completely, as if something had suffocated all sound there ever was. Whir of the fridge, beat of the wall clock, tick of the radiator, all gone. I cautiously sat up, listening. And then I heard something. Not a noise, really. A presence, as if tension static clung on the periphery of awareness. A knowing. The air felt to be observed. The hall light was switched off. I walked barefoot onto the floor, cold in an instant. The wood boards were damp to the touch, although I knew they were not. It was the air. It clung to me like a sigh. The heat had been gone, although the heater had been on before. I walked into the hallway and paused there, looking along the dark corridor. It was longer than it had ever seemed to be. The space in the house seemed to be warped, as if space had stretched out while I was gone. Then the scratching, gentle, random, just the side of the guest room door on the other side. Not metal, not cat, but more. Skin to wood. Fingers, possibly. Slow and purposeful. I did not stir. My heart was thudding in my ribcage, the thudding echoing in the silence. Then it ceased. I blinked. The guest room door, ajar before, now stood ajar. Not ajar, but just enough. Enough to look. Enough to ask questions about your memory. Had it always been so? I comforted myself that it had. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. The following day, I attempted to make rational sense. The human mind is adept at flattening the unfamiliar into the known. I explained the scratching away as the house settling in the cold. I explained the guest room door ajar because of a lack of balance on its hinges. These falsehoods are such as gauze, thin, transparent solace that is barely sufficient to dress the wound. But the wound cut deeper. I found myself observing the mirrors. It was subtle at first. A delay, perhaps, in reflection. I'd pass the hallway mirror and catch a glimpse of myself, but the image would linger just a heartbeat too long, as though reluctant to release me. In the bathroom, my face seemed slightly off, too pale, too still. The eyes in the mirror did not seem to hold my thoughts. They seemed to wait. On the third evening, I dreamed of water, an infinite black pool under a moonless and starless sky. There were skeletal trees around it, with bare branches and crab-like reaching towards the sky. I floated on top of it, weightless, like the universe had forsaken the laws of physics as far as I was concerned. There was something moving in the water. It was slow moving, gigantic, like a snake. It was invisible, but it was like it was watching me. It knew my name. I woke up with wet sheets, not sweat, water, cold and still. My skin puckered like I'd been underwater. But the bed was dry the next instant when I woke up and flipped on the lamp. Not even a whisper of dampness lingered. I didn't leave the house. I didn't use my phone or call anyone. I couldn't tell you why. It felt taboo. Something shifted in the air, in the beat of the house. Some of the rooms were denser, as if gravity itself had bent just a little bit around the edges. The back door to the attic groaned open by itself, but there was nothing there. The basement light pulsed in patterns that sounded like Morse code, though I couldn't decipher the message. But I knew it wasn't for me. It was for roughly me. Things started to come into play. Little things first. A pen moved off center. A cabinet door cracked open. And then more disturbing ones. Shoes moved to the foot of my bed. A puddle of water on the hallway floor that disappeared nowhere. My toothbrush missing. The attic window ajar, though nailed shut for years. And always the mirrors. Now they were never quite right. They seemed to throb with an in and out light on the perimeters as though the glass were on fire and alert. I sheeted most of them, unable to endure the silenced echo of my own eyes met by not familiarity but interest. On the fifth night, I could really hear the hum. Low, dissonant, old. It didn't come from any room but from deep inside the walls themselves, shaking the very fabric of the house. A soundless chant, a vibration. I braced myself against the living room wall and could feel it shudder against me like air on skin. Then I discovered the crawl space. I had not recalled it was there previously, camouflaged under the stairs behind the bookshelf. A small patch of blackness, revealed when the shelf groaned over to one side on a gentle, reluctant creak. The air that released from it was colder than human, and ancient, reeked with the reek of decayed flowers. Within, just discernible, a tiny roll of cloth, bound up with what appeared to be hair. I didn't touch it. I stepped back and pushed the shelf forward. The dreams came later that night, but they no longer seemed like dreams. I was back under black, lightless, weightless, and I saw it. A giant eye, door wide, opened below me. Not human, not even animal, just huge, pupilless, and hungry. I tried to scream, but water gushed up into my throat. I sat up choking, my lungs afire, as if I had breathed something besides air. I coughed water onto my sheets. Black water, thick, earthy, and rusty taste. By day 6, there was no peace in the house. It whispered, not in words, but in texture. Delicate crackling from the fire grate, even though it had never been lit. A beat to the rain on the panes that resonated with my heart. The ceiling groaned above me as I shifted, as if someone monitored my every move from above. There were no footsteps, just coordinated pressure. I started sleeping on the couch, staying away from bedrooms, mirrors, and the guest bedroom too. The TV wouldn't switch on. The clock hands went round and round. I had no idea what time it was. I didn't even know whether I was awake. On the 7th night, I sat there by myself with all lights blazing, all bulbs on. But the edge of the room was darker than it should have been, as if light shunned them with horror. I attempted to hum, to mask the low, vibrating chant echoing the walls, but my voice did not belong to me. And then the figure appeared. It hovered just at the end of the hallway, tall, formless, too long, not shadow, not substance. Its head rested against the ceiling, its arms at its sides, motionless. But I knew, gut deep, instinctively, that it had never not been in the house, that it hadn't entered, that it had waited, for me, for quiet. My mind locked in static. My body would not move. The lights flickered down, and still it stood. Then it moved, slow, steady, silent. With every step, the air was as syrupy. Time distorted. The walls pulsed. The mirrors shook in their cases. My heart pounded once, twice, before it was gone, leaving only silence so dense, I believed the world to have ended. I did not die. I awoke in bed. Morning light streamed through blinds. All was normal, nearly. And now, I am never alone. The mirrors still echo. My image still screams. The crawl space is gone, but I can feel it stuck in the walls. And if I walk through the house, I can feel the floorboards recalling, reliving. I am not alone in my home. I never was, and neither are you. I should have never gone back. The memory of that cabin feels less like a page of my past and more like something implanted on my head. Foreign, oppressive, vibrating with a presence that still stirs me in the lonely hours just before the dawn. I did not return for nostalgia or excitement. I returned because of a letter. It arrived on an October morning, tucked between bills and political flyers. There was no return address. Just my name scrawled in black ink across the envelope. On a single piece of heavy, yellowed paper, 10 words in the same weird handwriting were typed. The land remembers. You must reclaim what was taken. The words sloped, unstable, as if written by someone struggling to keep her grip, not on the pen, but on her mind. I knew instantly what it said. I hadn't thought about the cabin in years. Not since my grandfather died and the property went to my uncle, estranged from me, who vanished months later without warning. The cabin was lost in the center of Vermont's forest north, surrounded by nothing but the infinite trees and forgotten logging roads that didn't show up on any modern map. The deed had lain dormant in probate court for a decade, until the letter came. Against better judgment, I drove through towns that were dwindling and into backcountry that consumed cell reception and sunlight alike. The air grew cooler, heavier. By the time I veered onto the unmarked gravel road, it felt as though the forest itself had leaned in to listen. The highway curved up, twisting like a scar, growing smaller mile by mile. My tires tore through dry leaves and crunchy branches. It was almost dark when I saw it, cased in among fat pines, ashamed of its existence. The cabin, its roof sagged low like a tired brow. Moss-stained shingles rotting. Porch steps were broken, half consumed by the earth. But still, it seemed unbroken, maintained not by time, but by something else, something older. I stepped out of the car, the chill seeping into my bones immediately. There was silence in the air, not tranquility, but absence. No birds, no insects. Even the wind kept the clearing at arm's length. I unlocked it with the key I had still been able to retain, twisted and rusty at the tip. The lock clicked quite surprisingly. It was dark inside, the kind of darkness that doesn't feel so much like a lack of light, but more like a deliberate omission. Dust had settled on everything, as thick as ash, like the smoldering embers of an invisible fire. My granddad's things were all still there. His reading chair by the fireplace, the elk antlers overhanging the mantel, his old flannel still hanging on the coat hook. But the photos really disturbed me. Black and white photos in frames hung on the walls. My family's generations, serious-looking faces, unnervingly sharp eyes. I knew none of them. Their faces weren't incorrect in shape, but incorrect in sense. There was something behind their eyes, something too sharp for a photograph. I didn't sleep at night. The bed sagged like water-saturated sand, but pressure wasn't what prevented me from sleeping. It was the noise, in the walls at first. Tap, 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 like rain on wood. Yet there was never rain. Then there were the footsteps. They started in the kitchen, silent and slow, measured, like they were checking each board. Every time I gained the nerve to go see, there was nothing. Just the shadows, spreading out like an open mouth. By the third night, the steps came to the bedroom door. I began dreaming, if you could call them dreams. They felt like someone else's memory, wandering through the woods under a swollen moon, holding something in my hands, wet and warm. A ring of hooded monks chanting in a language that had the taste of copper and earth. I woke up one morning with dirt underneath my fingernails and a smudge of something dark on the sheets. I stopped sleeping. I went through my grandfather's notebooks anyway. I had no idea he had any, but there were dozens of them stacked up in a locked drawer at the bottom of the fireplace. They were full of nonsense, winding scroll-like prose about ancestral debt, the covenant of blood, the hunger under the roots. One sent shivers down to the bone. The forest remembers the first offering. It remembers the desecration. The land isn't ours. We leased it for a moment. The payment is memory. The price is self. It went on, falling into catalogs of limiting phrases. Do not look at the tree with the broken face. The name is not to be said. If your mother's voice comes to your ears, do not answer. I heard her that night, quiet, from outside the cabin, just beyond. Her voice, soft and singing, just like I recalled as a kid. She called my name once, then twice, coming closer and closer. But I had lost my mother 6 years ago. I didn't open the door. I began keeping count the days by scratch marks on the walls. But I ran out. Time dragged out where I was. The sky over the cabin seemed frozen in perpetual twilight. Even after the sun pushed through the trees, the cabin remained dark, as if light couldn't penetrate its walls. I began to notice other things. A shadow that reached in the wrong direction. A reflection on the window that wasn't keeping up with me. I would see knocking on the walls, in rhythms. 3 knocks, wait. 2 knocks, wait. Then 3 again. Like code, Morse. I never cracked it. It was one morning when I discovered the cellar door to be open. I didn't even know the cabin had a cellar. The air that drifted up from downstairs was moist and biting, smelling of iron and mold. I stood at the head of the stairs for a good while. I don't know why I ever did go down. Maybe I was already part of the cabin by then. The stairs were stone, slick. The darkness was near total, save for the dim light of my flashlight. The cellar was larger than it had any business being. Burrowed deep in the earth, the walls were not wood or concrete, but packed dirt, like a rabbit's warren. In the middle stood a crude altar, a chunk of granite, splashed with something dark and dried. Bones scattered all around it. Animal, I hoped. In distorted, whirling designs, symbols had been inscribed into the stone with something metallic. My flashlight faltered as I moved closer. And then there was the mirror. It leaned against the rear wall, draped in a moth-eaten velvet cloth that was decaying. It was awry, old, its frame bearing those same markings I had seen in the journals. I shouldn't have, but I pushed the cloth aside. What glared back at me wasn't my face. It borrowed my face, yes, but the eyes were too big, the mouth too unmoving. Its eyes locked with mine. I couldn't turn away. My skin was warm, then icy, then vanished. The mirror began to ripple, the surface warping as though it were water. Behind my not me, I saw a forest, not the one up top, but something else. Endless, evil, where the trees bled and the stars watched. I let the cloth fall and ran. I don't remember how I got back upstairs. The cabin was dark, quiet. I packed up my few things and left that evening. I didn't care about the road. I ran through the woods, branches ripping at my arms, thorns cutting my legs. I didn't stop until I saw headlights on a distant highway. I never told anyone, but things followed me home. I catch them in the mirror. Not always, just when I turn around. A catch of something off in the corner of my eye. Now and then I wake to the scent of moss and blood. Now and then I hear the knocking. 3. Stop. 2. Stop. 3. I've tried burning the journals. They won't burn. I've moved addresses, used false names, but the dreams won't go away. The forest remembers, and now I do. It wasn't a letter. It was a calling, an inheritance, a curse wrapped in lineage and time. And someday soon, I'll return. And this time, I won't leave.